Hi there. I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
When my sister looked across the table, dabbed her napkin on the corner of her mouth like she was about to deliver the Sermon on the Mount, and said, "If you weren't so desperate to marry first, maybe you'd actually find someone better." It felt like the whole bakery went silent, like the air itself stopped to listen to what she'd just thrown into the middle of our cake, tasting like a grenade wrapped in fondant. Jason, my fiancé, didn't even blink. He just looked over at me, eyebrows slightly raised, waiting to see what I'd do. And I just nodded. I didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't even smile. That quiet nod said everything, and what it said was, "I'm done." That night, after the samples had been packed into tiny pink boxes and we'd driven home in silence, Jason poured me a glass of wine, picked up his phone, and asked, "Do you want to call Clara, or should I?" To understand how we ended up there, me with a half-eaten raspberry champagne cupcake in my hand, wondering if this was going to be the moment that split my family in two, you have to understand my sister, Amber. Amber isn't just competitive. She breathes it like air. Growing up, she wasn't content to be the smarter one or the prettier one. She had to be the first at everything. First to drive, first to get into college, first to get engaged, even though her first engagement didn't last longer than a flu season, and I always let her. I figured if letting her win meant peace at the dinner table, then what did it cost me, really? But then came Jason, and something about this relationship, about me finally stepping into something real and good, set something off in her that I don't think even she knew was still hiding underneath that glossy, blowout perfect smile. Jason had arranged the cake tasting at this upscale boutique bakery that Amber had raved about when she was planning her own wedding. I thought, maybe this was a peace offering. She offered to join us, help guide us through the options, give her brutally honest opinion on buttercream versus whipped frosting. What I didn't expect was to be picked apart like a stale lemon tart by someone who knew exactly how to dress cruelty and charm. It started small, little jabs. "Oh, vanilla? That's brave. So safe." Or, "I guess you're just not a chocolate couple." Like that somehow implied we were boring or sexless or bland. Jason kept his responses polite, patient. He was raised better than to poke the bear, but I could feel him tensing every time she leaned in with a comment that only someone who had spent their whole life cataloging your insecurities could come up with. And then came the bomb. We were sampling the last round. Almond amaretto, I think, and the baker had stepped away to check on another client. That's when Amber leaned back, sighed dramatically, and let the insult fly like it was just a passing thought. "If you weren't so desperate to marry first, maybe you'd actually find someone better." Like Jason wasn't sitting right there. Like I hadn't waited through 3 failed relationships, 3 almosts, 2 moving in togethers, and 1 engagement that never even made it to ring shopping. Jason froze. And I knew if I said one word, if I defended myself or even acknowledged her, we'd just be playing her game again. So I nodded. Just once. That was it. We finished the tasting, thanked the baker, and walked out without another word. Later that night, as Jason poured me a drink, he didn't say, "Are you okay?" or "Do you want to talk about it?" He knew better. He just asked, "Do you want to call Clara, or should I?" Clara was his college friend, now a lawyer, who had helped us handle some legal stuff with the house we were buying. But she also had a reputation for being precise, ruthless, and meticulous, especially when it came to contracts, business ownership, and intellectual property. "I'll call her Tor," I said, and I meant it. Because this wasn't about a cake or a wedding. It was about finally drawing a line in the sand that Amber couldn't smirk her way across. It was about finally saying, enough. What Amber didn't know, and what I hadn't told anyone outside of Jason and Clara, was that I'd recently discovered a few curious things about her boutique skincare line. Things that, if true, could turn her entire clean beauty empire into a liability overnight. I wasn't sure yet, but I had screenshots and whispers and 1 supplier contact who seemed very, very eager to talk once they realized who I was related to. So that night, while Jason typed out a bullet point summary for Clara and I compiled a folder of documents, I realized that Not at the Bakery had been more than just the end of an afternoon. It had been the start of something. We weren't going to yell. We weren't going to call family and make drama. We were going to be smarter, sharper, quiet like a fuse before it burns. And when the papers finally landed in her mailbox, hand-delivered by a process server who asked, "Are you Miss Amber Delaney?" while she stood on her boutique's front step, smiling for an Instagram live story, that was the moment she stopped laughing. The night after the cake tasting incident didn't end in shouting or tears or even a strained phone call to my mother, asking why she ever let Amber get away with being the way she is. Instead, it ended in the quiet clink of ice cubes in a glass of wine, the soft scratch of Jason's pen against paper as he jotted notes beside my laptop, and the subtle, unmistakable shift in our dynamic from passive victims of my sister's verbal sabotage to active participants in something much colder, more deliberate, and frankly, long overdue. Clara, Jason's longtime friend turned attorney, had barely needed context when we reached out. She'd been around Amber exactly once, during a dinner last summer when Amber had gone out of her way to ask Jason what kind of prenup he was making me sign, not even bothering to disguise the dig as a joke. And Clara, who had grown up with 3 older brothers who tried to bully her into submission, had developed a particular taste for women like my sister. Beautiful, powerful, and endlessly underestimating the people around them. Clara scheduled a Zoom call the next morning, and I found myself sitting across from her on the screen, still in my bathrobe, hair tied up in a loose bun, while Jason took notes beside me like we were preparing for some corporate audit instead of laying the groundwork for a personal reckoning. "You're sure you want to go this route?" she asked. Not patronizingly, not doubtfully, but the way a doctor might ask if you're ready to proceed with a surgery that, while necessary, is going to hurt. I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, and the word felt like the first deep breath after holding it in for years. Over the next few days, Jason and I began gathering information. Not gossip, not speculation, but actual documents, screenshots, social media posts with timestamps that contradicted claims Amber had made publicly, emails from clients of hers who had reached out to me in confidence after hearing through the grapevine that something might be up. It had started a few months earlier when one of my own clients, a woman who owned a chain of spas and had purchased wholesale quantities of Amber's high-end skincare, mentioned in passing that the ingredient list on some of the bottles didn't match up with the product descriptions online. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, chalking it up to a printing error or an overworked assistant. But now, with everything Amber had said at the bakery echoing in my head, I started to see it differently. There was one email in particular that stood out, an exchange between Amber and a cosmetics lab in Nevada, where she requested a change in formula to use a cheaper alternative for a preservative ingredient, specifically asking that the packaging remain the same to avoid customer confusion. The ingredient she requested to substitute had been flagged in several clean beauty communities for causing skin irritation in sensitive users, and while it wasn't illegal per se, it danced right up to the line of what you could call deceptive marketing. Clara's eyes lit up when I forwarded her that thread. "This," she said, "is where we begin." We weren't going to file anything public yet. The idea wasn't to destroy Amber overnight. It was to remind her that the game she loved to play with everyone's lives wasn't a game she'd continue to win unchallenged. Clara drafted a formal letter, dense with legalese and subtle implications, hinting at misrepresentation and breach of consumer trust. And though it didn't accuse her of a crime, it made very clear that the evidence we possessed could be passed along to the appropriate channels if the situation escalated. She called it a gentle pressure tactic, but it felt more like placing a chess piece in the center of the board and daring the other player to make the wrong move. Still, I knew better than to believe Amber would react predictably. She had always operated with this unshakable belief that she was invincible, that her charm could melt any opposition, that her beauty and connections would insulate her from consequences. And I couldn't deny that she had, for most of her life, been right. So instead of confronting her directly, I decided to bait the hook a little more carefully. I invited her to a small bridal brunch I was hosting the following weekend. Just a handful of women, no drama, no speeches, just mimosas and tiny sandwiches, and a chance to celebrate together. I even let her pick the restaurant. She responded within 15 minutes with a thumbs-up emoji and a gif of a champagne toast. What she didn't know was that the wording in the invitation, so casual, so sweet, had included a clause, buried in plain sight, referencing vendors, partners, and collaborators in attendance, which, according to Clara, would classify any business disclosures made during the brunch as part of a public setting, not a private one. In other words, if Amber chose to brag about her products or her partnerships, she'd be waiving a layer of confidentiality she often claimed to shield her most dubious practices. Clara called it a social loophole, a strategy lifted right out of the playbook of white-collar prosecutors who deal with slippery CEOs and their PR-smoothed lies. The night before the brunch, Jason and I sat across from each other at the kitchen island, reviewing our plan one last time. He was calm, methodical, and maybe even a little bit amused by how seriously I was taking all of it. But for me, it wasn't just about what Amber said at that cake tasting. It was about every time she humiliated me in front of a boyfriend, every birthday she hijacked with her own announcements, every whispered comment to our parents about how worried she was that I might end up alone. It was about years of swallowing my pride because keeping the peace felt more important than standing up for myself. That part of me was gone now. As I slipped into bed that night, phone buzzing quietly on the nightstand, with a final message from Clara, let's see how she responds, I closed my eyes and smiled. Not out of vengeance or hatred, but out of something colder and steadier, certainty. Because tomorrow, when Amber showed up in her designer sunglasses and that ever-perfect blowout, ready to dominate another room with her charm and thinly veiled jabs, she wouldn't realize she was walking straight into a room I had built from the ground up, not to welcome her, but to expose her. And if she wanted to keep laughing, she'd have to do it knowing that the punchline might be coming from me this time. The day of the bridal brunch arrived, draped in the kind of sunshine that makes everything look deceptively perfect. The kind of golden morning that dares you to believe that bad things don't happen on days like this. But I knew better. I knew that even the most picturesque settings could conceal the sharpest blades. And this brunch, with its pastel tablecloths and lavender-infused lemonade, was less about cucumber sandwiches and Instagram moments, and more about the beginning of a very calculated unraveling. Amber showed up exactly 13 minutes late, a habit of hers that had evolved from mildly irritating to masterfully strategic, because she believed arriving fashionably late meant people would talk about her more, and unfortunately she wasn't wrong. Heads turned as she entered in a linen jumpsuit that probably cost more than my entire floral budget. Sunglasses perched on her head, a curated, effortless look that screamed, I woke up like this, but spent 2 hours doing so. She greeted everyone with that syrupy, high-gloss warmth that people mistake for charm when they don't know her well. Air kisses, loud compliments, little laughs that never reached her eyes. And then she slid into the seat beside me like we were co-conspirators instead of adversaries, leaning in close enough for her perfume to overwhelm the basil in the centerpiece as she whispered, You look radiant, sis. Love that you're not afraid to go natural. So bold. And just like that, the first move was made. I smiled, of course. Tight, polite, practiced. The smile of someone who's not playing along, but simply biding time. The brunch moved along at its expected pace, with small talk, a few awkward toasts, and the usual how did you two meet stories that felt more scripted the closer we got to the wedding. Amber, of course, found her moment to shine when the conversation turned to skincare, as it always does when she's in any room for more than 10 minutes, and with just the right amount of faux humility, she launched into her well-rehearsed monologue about building a brand from the ground up, about her clean beauty mission, and about her deep connection with every ingredient she uses. So pure, so carefully sourced, so lovingly selected. It was during this part, as she recited her origin story like a bedtime fairy tale, that I saw Clara's plan unfold perfectly. She mentioned a new product launch and casually dropped the name of the lab she was using. An offhand comment, seemingly innocent, but one that tied her statements directly to the supplier we now had documented concerns about. And that was the moment I felt it. That quiet, invisible click of a puzzle piece locking into place. The first tangible sign that she'd taken the bait, and taken it eagerly. Later, when everyone had gone, and the leftover pastries had been boxed up, I found myself alone in the venue's small back room, scrolling through the audio notes Clara had helped me record. Nothing illegal, nothing invasive, just insurance, a way to keep track of what had been said publicly and what had been said in confidence. I wasn't trying to trap her, not exactly. I was simply making sure that the story she loved to tell could finally be measured against the truth she worked so hard to obscure. That week, Jason and Clara worked quietly behind the scenes, building the framework for what would soon become something much harder for Amber to laugh off. Clara had already contacted a compliance consultant to double-check the ingredients Amber had listed publicly, and they had flagged 3 discrepancies that, while not explosive on their own, could become very problematic if presented as part of a broader pattern of misrepresentation. Meanwhile, I started making quiet calls to a few of Amber's boutique partners, the ones I knew had been stiffed on inventory last fall when she claimed a warehouse mix-up, and I gently, without accusation, asked whether they'd noticed anything off. The responses varied, but the theme remained: delayed shipments, inconsistent branding, evasive answers. None of them were ready to go public, not yet, but they were all very interested in hearing what I had to say once I was ready to speak. And then came the dinner. It was a casual family gathering at my parents' house, nothing fancy, just grilled salmon and a big salad, and the usual tension masked with jokes about politics and traffic. Amber, oblivious or pretending to be, showed up with a bottle of overpriced wine and a smugness that felt freshly polished. I didn't plan to confront her there, not really, but as the night wore on and she once again steered the conversation toward her latest collaboration, dropping names of influencers and clean beauty platforms like confetti, I couldn't stop myself. I asked one question, simple, direct, loaded. How do you manage to maintain transparency with so many product changes? Doesn't that complicate your compliance reports? The silence that followed was brief but electric. Amber blinked, then smiled. "That's what my team is for," she said, with a laugh that sounded like glass cracking. I nodded, let it go, but I saw it. That flicker of doubt in her eyes, the moment she realized the playing field might be shifting. She didn't know what I had, not yet. But she knew something had changed, and that was enough to tilt the game in my favor. That night, Clara sent me a message, just 3 words. "We're almost there." Attached was a draft of the legal letter she'd prepared. Part cease and desist, part formal notice, part warning shot. It was elegant, precise, and brutal in its clarity. It didn't accuse Amber outright, but it laid out a narrative backed by data, emails, and statements that would be very difficult to ignore. And best of all, it offered her a choice: step back quietly or prepare for a deeper look into her business that would not be confined to brunch tables and family dinners. I stared at the draft for a long time, rereading every line, feeling both powerful and, if I'm honest, slightly nauseous. This wasn't some high school spat anymore. This was going to leave marks. And I knew once I sent that letter, there would be no going back. But as I stood in my kitchen, glass of wine in hand, phone glowing with Clara's message, I thought of that moment at the cake tasting, the way Jason looked at me, waiting to see what I'd do. And I realized I wasn't the same person who had nodded quietly and swallowed the insult. That woman had been tired. This one was ready. And tomorrow, when Amber opened that envelope, printed on heavy stock with Clara's firm embossed in silver at the top. She'd feel it too, that quiet, sudden weight of a game she hadn't even realized she was about to lose. There's a peculiar stillness that comes over you in the moments before something irreversible takes place, not unlike the quiet before a thunderstorm, when the air feels charged and your skin senses the weight of something approaching. And that stillness settled over me the morning we were scheduled to deliver the letter. A sensation not of dread exactly, but of clarity, like I had crossed some invisible line from hesitation into intention, and there was no retreating now, only moving forward into the eye of whatever came next. I had slept only 3 hours, though I never fully drifted off. Instead, I lay beside Jason in that thick silence that follows a long-awaited decision, running every scenario through my head and bracing for the version where everything went sideways. Because when you're about to expose your sister's business practices to legal scrutiny and social fallout in one elegant motion, the idea of failure isn't about losing. It's about waking up to find the bridge behind you already on fire. We didn't dress for war, we dressed for brunch. A soft olive blouse, slacks with just the right taper, nothing too loud, nothing that screamed, "Watch me destroy someone's credibility over mimosas." Jason wore a blazer that he usually reserved for mediations and real estate closings, and if I didn't know him better, I'd have thought he was nervous. But his composure had always been one of his greatest assets, something Amber had mistaken for blandness during their first meeting, a misread I had filed away with all her other poor judgments. He looked at me as I adjusted my earrings, held my gaze in the mirror, and asked one last time, "You ready for this?" And for the first time, I didn't need to lie or pretend or justify. I simply said, yes. We had arranged to meet Amber at her loft under the pretense of going over final wedding guest details. I had made it sound casual, spontaneous even, like I just wanted her thoughts on the table layout, or whether we needed more vegetarian options. She agreed quickly, almost too eagerly, as if she sensed a moment to regain some kind of control, to wedge herself back into the center of my plans, where she had always believed she belonged. Her building, one of those converted warehouse spaces that screamed curated authenticity, stood like a monument to the version of her she most wanted the world to see, minimalist, successful, untouched by compromise. The irony wasn't lost on me as we stepped into the industrial chic elevator and rose toward a confrontation that had been brewing for years, beneath layers of passive-aggressive smiles and performative sisterhood. She opened the door in leggings and a silk tunic, barefoot, holding a green smoothie she'd no doubt post about later as part of her Sunday self-care ritual, and greeted us with a brightness so forced it almost cracked on delivery. Come in, she said, sweeping her arm theatrically, gesturing towards a seating area, staged like a lifestyle magazine spread. I stepped inside, careful not to track any of the real world across her curated floors, and we sat exchanging pleasantries that sounded like dialogue from a bad play, until Jason reached into his briefcase and slid the envelope across the glass table between us. Amber blinked once, the way you might if someone unexpectedly handed you a grenade disguised as a wedding invitation, and stared at the heavy, cream-colored paper for a few long seconds before finally speaking. "What's this?" she asked, tone carefully neutral, but I could see the tremor in her hand as she set her glass down too quickly, the contents sloshing against the rim. I leaned forward slightly, not to be dramatic, but because I wanted her to see my face clearly when I said it. "It's a letter from Clara. You'll want to read it carefully." Jason remained silent, a steady presence beside me, and I could feel the heat rising in the room as Amber picked up the envelope and began to open it, her movement slower now, less certain. As her eyes scanned the first few lines, the change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. Her brows pulled together slightly, the corners of her mouth twitching not downward, but inward, as if trying to hold something back, a gasp, a curse, a defense she hadn't yet assembled. She turned a page, then another, and then finally set the letter down, lifting her eyes to mine with a smile so brittle it could have shattered with a whisper. "Are you serious?" she asked, voice flat, devoid of the condescension she usually cloaked herself in. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I pulled my phone from my bag and tapped the screen once, then slid it across the table toward her. "Check your email," I said, and then sat back. She hesitated, then lifted her phone from the side table, unlocked it, and as she scrolled, I watched her face shift from curiosity to confusion to something else entirely. Fear, perhaps, or the cold recognition that the walls she had built with so much arrogance and branding were now made of glass, and someone had just turned on the lights. What she found in that inbox were the documents Clara had compiled: product inconsistencies, supplier emails, financial discrepancies, and statements from former collaborators who, while not yet public, had agreed to step forward if necessary. There were no accusations, no inflammatory language, just facts, lined up like a slow, deliberate march toward accountability. Amber set the phone down with a soft thud and stared at me, silent now, her expression unreadable. For the first time, she looked less like the untouchable golden child and more like a woman who had bet too heavily on her own invincibility. She opened her mouth once, then closed it, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, strained. "Why would you do this? We're family." The temptation to laugh was sharp, but I resisted it. Instead, I met her gaze and said, "Because you never treated me like family, you treated me like competition, and you crossed a line." Jason reached for the envelope, folding it neatly before sliding it back into his briefcase. "You're not being sued," he added calmly. "But this is a formal warning. You have the opportunity to correct the issues voluntarily before someone else forces you to." Amber said nothing. She didn't reach for her phone again. She didn't rage or cry or throw us out. She simply sat there, caught in that stillness I had felt earlier, now weighed down by its full meaning. As we stood to leave, I paused at the door, glancing back at the sister I had spent a lifetime trying to keep the peace with, realizing that whatever came next, whatever fallout or redemption or scandal, this was the moment everything changed. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel regret. I felt ready. The hours following our confrontation at Amber's loft unfolded with a strange and almost surreal silence, as though the world itself was holding its breath to see what she would do next. And despite all the preparation, all the careful maneuvering, and all the calculated confidence that had led us to that moment, I found myself hovering somewhere between unease and calm, unable to fully anchor myself in either emotion because something inside me, some quietly persistent intuition, was whispering that this wasn't over, that someone like Amber doesn't collapse after a single strike, no matter how precise or well-documented it might be. Jason, ever the pragmatic one, spent the drive home reviewing Clara's notes and cross-referencing potential follow-ups, but I sat in the passenger seat staring out the window, watching the city blur past and wondering whether I had truly delivered justice or if I had simply opened a door that couldn't be shut again. Amber didn't call that night, which in itself was unusual. Silence from her was never apathy. It was strategy, and the absence of a flurry of text messages or a frantic phone call to our parents told me she was retreating, regrouping, and most likely building her own version of events that could be deployed the moment she felt cornered. I had seen her do it before, reframe a story so convincingly that even people who'd witnessed the truth began to question their memory. And I knew it was only a matter of time before she attempted to reclaim control, not through facts, but through perception. That's the part she excelled at, the part that had always made her so dangerous. The next morning, I woke up to a flurry of missed calls, not from Amber, but from our cousin Marcy, whose loyalty, while usually fluid depending on which side of the family feud served better wine, had always leaned slightly in my favor. She left a voicemail in that nervous, half-whispered tone that only ever meant one thing: trouble. I played it twice just to catch every word. Amber had gone dark on social media. No new posts, no stories, not even her usual motivational quote to start the week. And while that may not sound like much to anyone else, in Amber's world, where visibility equaled power and every shared latte was part of a brand narrative, the silence was not only unusual, It was calculated. Jason and I met Clara later that afternoon to go over our next steps. Not because we intended to pursue legal action, at least not yet, but because Clara, ever cautious, believed in documenting everything, in creating a clear trail that would make it impossible for Amber to paint herself as a victim without contradicting her own history. We sat in her office with our laptops open, a collection of PDFs and archived emails lined up like evidence at a trial that hadn't yet begun. And for the first time in weeks, I found myself hesitating, not because I doubted the facts or questioned the strategy, but because a part of me, buried and stubborn, still wanted this to end with an apology, not a battle. I knew it was naive, foolish even, to expect someone like Amber to admit fault. But deep down, I didn't want to dismantle her. I wanted her to finally see me as something more than a threat. That evening, as Jason and I sat on the porch watching the last light fade behind the hills, I got the message I didn't expect and somehow knew was coming. It wasn't a call nor a text, but a voicemail, just under 20 seconds long, delivered in a tone that didn't sound like rage or sadness, but something colder, something far more dangerous. Certainty. Her voice, low and calm, said, "I read everything. You've been busy. Just remember, I still know things too. Things you haven't told Jason. Let's not pretend we're the only ones who know how to play this game." I replayed it twice, heart hammering in that quiet, relentless rhythm of fear mixed with fury. Jason, who was watching me closely now, asked what it said, and I, staring at the screen, trying to process the weight of what she had just implied, simply said, "She's not done." I didn't elaborate, and he didn't press, because we both understood something fundamental in that moment. Whatever we thought we'd ended hadn't truly ended at all. The truth was, Amber and I had never really been sisters in the way people imagine sisters to be. We were adversaries cloaked in the illusion of kinship, two women raised to believe that love was finite and validation came at someone else's expense. And now that illusion had been shattered, revealing something darker and more honest beneath. I had won a battle, yes, forced her into silence, cornered her with truth. But I hadn't won the war, and I wasn't even sure anymore if winning was the point. In the days that followed, Amber's social media returned with subtle changes, fewer photos of herself, more reposts of third-party content, a shift in tone that suggested damage control without admission. The boutique remained open, but word spread quietly among her clientele that something was amiss, and though nothing exploded publicly, the undercurrent of doubt had been planted. And that, in the world she lived in, was often more lethal than any formal accusation. Clara called it a successful outcome, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted beneath my feet, like we had triggered a fault line, and the aftershocks hadn't even started yet. I never confronted Amber about the voicemail, never told Jason exactly what she said, not because I wanted to protect her, but because I wasn't sure how much of what she hinted at was truth and how much was theater. She had always known how to weaponize ambiguity, how to inject just enough suggestion into a threat to keep you wondering, and I wasn't about to let her steal my peace with a maybe. Still, I began to sleep with my phone face down, the ringer silenced, the world just a little less trustworthy than before. On the surface, life moved on, wedding plans resumed, invites went out, venues were confirmed, but beneath that surface, something lingered. A quiet reminder that every decision has a cost, and sometimes the price of silence is knowing you've only paused the storm, not survived it. And in those rare moments when I caught my reflection and saw something in my eyes that wasn't quite guilt, but wasn't peace either, I realized that this story wasn't about justice or revenge. It was about learning who I was when the pretending stopped. Because while the letter may have silenced her laughter, the game we were playing didn't end with ink and paper. It ended, if it ever truly did, in the quiet space between truth and what we're willing to destroy in order to protect it.